morning from me, and thank you, Christos. And hopefully we're going to get more people to join. I will start, and I will talk about two things, as Christos said. I will talk about the purpose and the usefulness of forecasting. It's basically an applied data science field. And I'll talk about the contribution of the M competitions. M stands for my last name, Makridakis, the first letter for my last name, and I'm the organizer. And as I'm going to talk, the first competition was done in 1980. So it has a long history. And now we're going to do the sixth competition. Okay. Maybe you have heard about the great toilet paper scarcity that happened about a year ago. And as you can see on the left here, the people bought all of the toilet paper. There were some newspaper stories that there would be scarcity in toilet paper. People went like crazy to buy for a few years, not just for a few months. And that's what happened. Okay. And you couldn't find toilet paper for a long time. That's how it looked like. The demand for toilet paper was going nicely up to the 10th of the 11th of March, and then on the 12th of March went to the sky, and then slowly went back to normal. Now this is a big forecasting failure, but interestingly, it's very difficult to predict it. And the question that could source the value of forecasting is how often you have been to a supermarket or to some other places to find what you want to buy and you couldn't find it. So basically, what is the role of forecasting? Is to make sure that in a big store like the Walmart, that they have up to 200,000 items, that the customers that they're going to go and they're going to look for some specific item, they're going to find it. And Walmart is one of the biggest, if not the biggest forecasting user in the world. They have close to 12,000 stores. There are about 200,000 items per store. And every week they do 2.3 million forecasts. So it's a big science behind the forecasting. And it's not the only company that does that. Target is another very big forecasting user. They have a lot of stores also. And basically what they're doing, they have a very elaborate forecasting system. And they do 1 billion weekly forecasts. Okay. So there is a lot behind when you go to a supermarket and you find what you want to find. There's a big science behind it to make sure that what you want to buy is going to be there. And very often we have scarcities like the toilet paper scarcity or some other scarcities of this type. So how do we forecast? We forecast by finding data. This is the airline passengers in Australia. As you can see, it's a very nicely behaving series. It has a very constant, smooth trend and a lot of seasonality. The highest is in the beginning of the year in January, after Christmas. In Australia, it's summer, so the summer months, there's a bigger demand, and then the airline passengers go down in the winter months of Australia. Now, even if you take a good artist, you can find the continuation of this pattern. So the idea then for forecasting is we collect data, past data, and then we use some method to be able to extrapolate. And in this particular case, going to extrapolate the trend and it's going to extrapolate the seasonality. Now, there are different ways of forecasting. There are different, let's see, sorry. There's a part here that I don't know how to, okay, sorry. Okay, so there are different ways to forecast. There are different types of forecasting. This one is high blood pressure pills. The demand for this is very constant. There's very little fluctuations. For instance, people who have high blood pressure, they have to take a pill every day. So the demand and the forecasting for high blood pressure pills is constant. It's very easy to forecast. Another easy item to forecast is milk. It doesn't cost very much, in particular for people who have children. They have to buy it every day. So again, there is very constant demand and very little fluctuation. Now, if you take meat, this is another type of forecasting. The fluctuation here is much wider from day to day. And there's a lot of competition between different types of meat. For instance, chickens or porks or beef or different kinds. So how they manage to do it? By giving a lot of coupons, making price discounts, providing price discounts, and doing a lot of marketing to promote one type of meat versus another. So here, then the demand will be depending on several factors. And one of the big factors will be price, the other will be promotions, the other will be advertising. Another type of forecasting is fashion. Here, one cannot have a lot of historical data because the fashion changes, and the success of selling fashion items is how well the people are going to like them and buy them. Another type would be computers, laptop computers, for instance, or smart TVs. Here, a lot of the demand for these items will depend on the technological innovation, depend on the prices, depend on different factors that, for instance, the milk or the meat. Another type of items is luxury items. The demand here is very sporadic. For instance, half of the sales of this type of item may be at Christmas, for instance, Mother's Day, and things like this. So here there are a lot of peaks, and then there is close to zero. So it's a very different type of demand. And the challenge to forecast this is very different than forecasting milk or meat. And lastly, automobiles. It's a very expensive item, and it's influenced a great deal by what happens to the economy. To give you an example, this is the estimated sales for automobiles. Here, there was the Great Depression, the Great Recession, the 2007, 2009, and you see how much it dropped. Here is what happened after the coronavirus. So here, demand is influenced a great deal about what happens to the economy and what happens to the general environment. Like here now, the coronavirus, there's a very big drop in demand. For one reason is people drive much less, and the other is a lot of people don't have enough money to buy a car. So the field then of forecasting is concerned with all types of forecasting. And the idea is for each one will be a very different way to forecast it and to depend on very different factors. So other areas except retail forecasting, products forecasting that we're all used to, it's energy forecasting. Electricity consumption and prices are very important. And now there's a lot of forecasting in renewable energy, winds and photovoltaic. For companies that they produce electricity, for instance, they don't want to produce too much because if it is produced and it's not used, they're going to have resources wasted, fuel wasted, and they're not making enough money. This is an example of electricity prices. And we have a lot of data, and that's where we're using a lot of machine learning and deep learning methods to forecasting. Here we have no trend, we have multi-seasonal patterns. The seasonal pattern is different days of the week, there are different, the demand changes. There's more, for instance, on Fridays and on Mondays than there is on Saturdays. There is the hourly changes, for instance, in the morning and in the evening, and there are different seasonal patterns. And the whole idea then of the forecasting method is to be able to identify all of these patterns and predict them. And they're doing a lot of work, and there's a great jobs being done. Now, there's another area which there is a lot of forecasting in the financial area, in stocks, bonds, and currencies. This is an example of stock prices. There is a phenomenal constant trend, and because here it's a logarithmic trend, this trend is exponential, and there are huge fluctuations around the trend. For instance, in here, that was before the Great Recession, the Standard & Poor's 500 index was 2,240. Here it went to 928, and then now it's 3,500. So in terms of the long-term trend, there's a great stability. The real increases adjust for inflation. It's 4.1% every year. If you include dividends, it's 8.7%. And if you don't take real, but you take current prices, it's 11%. So on the average, the prices increase close to 11% every year. However, there are huge fluctuations. In July 2000, it was 2,240. 8 years later, a little less than 8 years later, it went down to 928. So there was a huge decrease, huge fluctuations, huge uncertainty. And then from March 2008 to today, to last month, or there was an increase of 280%. So huge fluctuations, very consistent trend. And these are the type of things we try to learn from forecasting. Okay? We try to learn how the data behaves, what's going to happen, and how we can understand as much about this data as possible. There are other areas that we do a lot of forecasting. Online sales, there's a big thing now with online sales. Google Trends, visitors or users in social media, social sites, online advertising revenues for the companies that are in these social sites, and airline passengers. Okay, so, and there are more areas, but this is a summary of the different areas. We do a lot of forecasting. So here, for instance, if I take a forecasting method and I stop in 2018 and I forecast for the next year, these are my 12 forecasts. And as you see, it's a pretty good forecast. Now, tell you some of the problems with forecasting. And again, this is something that one cannot predict. That's what happens now if I had to forecast in 2019, 2020. Because of the coronavirus, airline passengers went to practically zero, so my forecast was lousy. So forecasting then it's very accurate as long as past pattern and past relationships remain constant. However, like what happens with the pandemic, cannot forecast well because the patterns and the relationships change and they can change very drastically. Okay? So that would be then a failure of forecasting. But again, this failure shows that most of the time you can forecast pretty accurately. Now, you remember the evergreen ship that got stuck in the Suez Canal. Now, even one accident like this can create problems with the supply chain, and you can have difficulties in predicting, for instance, what will be the price of coffee or the price of even toilet paper, because there may be scarcity because of even one single event. So to come and summarize what is the value and the contribution of forecasting, the idea, the objective, the purpose is to predict as accurately as possible future events in order to improve the decisions about these events. For instance, a very concrete example for forecasting would be a supermarket predict how many bottles of a certain kind of milk customers are going to demand tomorrow. So that's a major thing about forecasting. Now, in addition, however, forecasting has two parts. One is to predict something as accurate as possible, and the other is to say that, look, none of my predictions will be perfect. So I have to estimate what will be the uncertainty around these predictions. In other words, I can say, okay, the most likely number for milk tomorrow for a certain type will be 55 bottles, but I know it's not going to be perfect. So I can say that it's going to be between 45 and 65 bottles. And this is then how we estimate uncertainty. And our forecasting methods do both things. They both forecast the most likely number, and then they give me a range about the uncertainty, the most likely uncertainty. And having then the most accurate number of forecasts, or the most likely and the uncertainty, then we can put them together and we can estimate, we can balance the opportunity cost and the opportunity losses, come up with how many bottles of milk should we put on the shelf. Knowing that if, in particular with milk, there's dates that they cannot sell it afterwards, then we can decide what would be the most logical or the optimal number of milks put on the shelves of the supermarket. Okay, so this is what is forecasting. And what I'm going to like to talk now is what are the contributions of the M competitions to improve the forecasting. And like you, we have all of the data, it's open source, they're available, easily available in GitHub. Anybody can go and find them, anybody can use them, and they are completely free to be used. Okay? And these forecasting competitions have received a lot of attention. and they have improved greatly the field of forecasting. And as I told you before, we have done 5 already, and we're in the process of designing the new one, the sixth one that I'm going to say a few things at the end. Okay, so what forecasting competitions are the equivalent of laboratory experimentations. So we try to get empirical evidence by doing these competitions. And they provide an objective and empirical evidence about the most accurate forecasting method, the most appropriate way to estimate uncertainty, trying to find the forecasting value added. And since we know the cost of running different methods, then we can decide which is the most appropriate method for each situation. So with all of these, then we offer a lot of information to prove the theory and the practice of forecasting. Okay. So what we have learned from these competitions, we know that we can explain the past very well. The challenge is to predict the future. And we're doing a lot of work on that. And I'm going to talk a little about this. What we have found out is that there is no any model which is the best model, but what we do is we predict, we identify, and we estimate a lot of models, and then we find the average of those models. And we know that now that machine learning and deep learning, they improve forecasting accuracy. And there is a big, big effort to develop methods which are based on the machine learning versus what we used before, which were statistical methods, that they were accurate up to a certain point, but now the machine learning, we found that they're more accurate. What we are not sure about is how to predict things in non-stable environments, like now with the pandemic. Since the pandemic lasts for only a year and it's not regular, we don't have enough historical information to know what could be its influence. What we are not sure is what's the performance of humans versus models. A lot of forecasts are done judgmentally. The models provide objective information, and we find out that very often the models are more accurate than humans. And what is the value of explanatory variables? Like the price influences the sales of a product. However, we may know what are the past prices, but we don't know what are the future prices. Because competitors can decrease the price and we may have to decrease the price, or something may happen that will oblige us to increase the price. The same thing is true with advertising and with all of the other variables that we call explanatory, that they help us forecast the future of demand. Now, what we don't know two things about uncertainty. Uncertainty in statistics, very often we have been told that it's nicely behaved and it's normally distributed, where that's not true. Very often uncertainty is far tails, like what is happening now with the pandemic. And there are black swans, things we cannot predict. We can understand what happens in the past, we can explain the past, but we cannot find causalities. And we have a lot of difficulties separating luck from skills. Okay? So the first competition, as I told you, was done in the early 80s. It was published in 1982. And what we found out in this first competition was that statistically sophisticated or complex methods were not more accurate than very simple ones. Statisticians didn't like that at that time. I was a statistician at that time, and I didn't like this, but that's what we found. And this is an example of what we found. The first one here, it's a very, very simple statistical method. This is a very, very sophisticated, the box check is a very sophisticated statistical method. Well, it was much less accurate. The simple method was much more, by 2.5% more accurate than the sophisticated one. It was a little better for 2 periods ahead, but on the average, it was less accurate than the simple method. Statisticians, as I told you, they didn't like that. This was another example of this box Jenkins method versus a very simple statistical one. And on the average, as you can see, apart from period 1 that was more accurate, in all of the others was less accurate than the sophisticated method of the simple one. The second finding is that the accuracy of the variant methods, if we combine them together, it was more accurate, outperformed the average of the individual methods. So taking the average forecast of more than one method improved the accuracy versus the simple versus the individual methods. And there was a big argument with statisticians at that time because they thought that there's the best for each time series, there's a best model. That was not the case. And the last thing, which was equally important, was the uncertainty of combining was lower than the uncertainty of individual methods. So these were the 3 major things that we found in the M1 competition. The M2 competition was between statistical methods and forecasters. And we're told that forecasters will do better than the statistical methods. Well, we found out that it was not the case. And we had 5 human forecasters, and their accuracy was lower than the statistical methods. These are 2 very, very simple statistical methods. On the average, there was 11.9 and 12.6, their accuracy. This is the sophisticated method, much, much worse. And these are the 5 forecasters. None of the forecasters did better than the simplest of statistical methods. So this tells us something about the value of the judgment of forecasters. Okay. So what we know that when people do judgmental forecasts, very often they're not better than if we take what we call a naive benchmark. In other words, saying that tomorrow the sales and the day after tomorrow will be like today. And 52% of the time, these 300,000 forecasts were less accurate than the benchmark. When forecasters and people and managers, they adjust the statistical forecast, often they don't improve their accuracy. And in order to do it, they have to do the adjustment objectively and systematically. And they have to concentrate on large changes. Very often they make small improvements, what they think small improvements, and actually they are not improvements. Okay. They have to justify the reasons for the adjustments, preferably written and anonymously. They don't like to do that. When they do it, they improve their adjustments. Then we have to keep track of the adjustments to evaluate their contribution and avoiding upward adjustments. Very often, the adjustments that they do, they are on the positive side. They think that they can improve because things are going to become better. And very often, that's not what is happening. Okay? Now, the third competition was much bigger. From 1,000 series we had in M1, we went to 3,300. Here now we did a nice sampling in terms of different domains, microdata, industry, macro, finance, demographic, etc., and different frequencies, yearly, quarterly, monthly, and others. And then we found the accuracy of each one of them. And it was very big improvement, this type of providing this type of information to forecasters. Okay. Now, what we found from the M1 and M2 was a new method called theta that was a variation of exponential smoothing, proved to be the most accurate by some small amount. Here, this was the accuracy of over naive 2 of theta, 2.5%. However, the combining, which was these three methods, these three exponential smoothing method, was 2%. So the improvement was 0.5%. So it was an improvement, but not very big improvement. Okay. Now, the M4 competition was much bigger. We went from 3,000 series to 100,000 series. By this time, that was done in 2018, computers were much bigger, much faster. We could accommodate much more data to do the competition. Again, we did a nice sampling in terms of data, having microdata, industry, and so on, and having different frequencies. Here we went, in addition to monthly, that was in the M3, we went to weekly, to daily, and to hourly. And we have a very big sample of time series. And the information we got, it was much more accurate this time because it was much wider. And we had many more series, and we had people participating from all over the world. Now, I'm not going to go through the 7 findings. I guess you can get this information from other places, but the finding that we found, and it continues to be correct in all of the competitions, the past and the futures, is the improved accuracy of combining. Before the M competitions, the statisticians believe that there is a best model for every time series. Well, we found that that's nonsense. That's actually the more models we combine, the better is the accuracy, and the smaller is the uncertainty. And this finding becomes even more important now in the deep learning models that they use for very important forecasting applications. They estimate up to 200 or 300 models, and they take the median of them, and they found out that this is the most accurate prediction. In the coronavirus forecast that they did, or they're still doing, they again finding out that the best forecast is if you take the average of all of the forecasts done by different agencies. So that was the most important finding. Now, in the M4 competition, the winning method was a hybrid approach that utilize statistical and machine learning features. And this basically method, this hybrid method that continue to exist now and has been continued with the M5 competition, made a big difference in forecasting accuracy. Okay. Now, another thing that we found with the M4 competition, that the precision of the prediction intervals of the uncertainty improved considerably. Okay. And several other things that I'm going to talk when I go to the M5 competition. Okay. Now, what the up to M4, we had a long forecasting winter. There was small improvements in accuracy between the different methods, the M3, the theta, but it was actually small. Okay. Nothing big, no breakthroughs. There was also a problem with estimating uncertainty that in all of the three competitions was underestimated significantly. And there was basically no new exciting method in the M1, M2, and M3. Now the M4 ended all of these by this new method that was introduced by a guy called Slawek Smil, who used to work at this time for Uber, and basically provided a significant increase in accuracy. All of this information has been put into a volume, into a special issue of the International General Forecast, which you can find if you're interested. And has something like 35 articles that they explain them for competition in details, and they provide guidance to both researchers and business people of what methods to use and how to use it, and provide an incentive of which way the theory of forecasting has to go. And a lot of these papers in this issue are open access, so if you put my name and you can find them, you can get them for free. Okay, now this is the mean absolute percentage error. This is the computer time, and the more computer time one spends, it seems that the accuracy improves. This is the method, the winning method, okay, and the time that it took to run it. Now the M5 competition, the M1, M3, and M4, M2 was a special one because it was a budget forecasting competition with live forecasters. So they cover practically every frequency and domain. The M5 was a special case. It was a hierarchical daily retailing data exhibiting intermittency. So here was at the level of the item, the SKUs, and then going all the way to the sales of the company for 3 stages. The data was given to us by Walmart. There was something like 43,000 series, and it was hierarchical, and that's how forecasting is done in the retailing industry. Now, intermittent demand is like this. As you see, there are a lot of zeros and then spikes. Lumpy demand, again, a lot of zeros and then some big spikes. Smooth series and erratic. So the data, the 42,000 time series that we had, combine these 4 types of data. The M5 was the first competition to study uncertainty details. We had two tracks, we had two challenges. One was who would forecast the most accurately the data, and the other is who would forecast uncertainty most accurately. Now, the first and most important finding was statistical methods were not as accurate anymore as machine learning methods. Again, we found that the value of combining all of the top methods, not only the best one, but all of the top methods were using combining. Another thing that was started in the M4 was cross-learning. Instead of trying to find the accuracy by looking at each one of the series, we try to find out the accuracy by using all of the series together, the idea of cross-learning. Now, another innovation in the M4 and in the M5 competition, instead of using all of the data to find the best model, we use part of the data. We separate the data into two parts, one being testing part, and the one being the validation part, and the other being the testing part. So we use part of the data to make a model, and then we test the model on the future with data we didn't use to develop the model. And then we did this on a rolling basis, and this cross-validation then avoided overfitting that was the problem with the previous statistical methods. There was a very big difference then in the M5 between the winning methods and the statistical benchmarks. And we found that some exogenous variables like Christmas or like Labor Day or like big days, like days that they attract a lot of people, can be used to explain, and some explanatory variables, like in the United States, they give food stamps, and when there were these stamps given, then they can explain very much what happened to the sales of the company. So this was then the M5 competition. Now, to summarize, the M competitions destroy three major forecasting myths: that there's a best model, there's no such a thing as a best model in forecasting. We improve accuracy by combining models. And in addition to improving accuracy, we reduce the variance of the uncertainty of the forecasting. The future is never a perfect continuation of the past. So instead of overfitting, we use cross-validation to make our best model. And instead of using each series separately to determine the accuracy of all of the models, we use then the idea of cross-learning to improve overall accuracy. We use, in other words, all of the series. So combining cross-validation and cross-learning added to the long forecasting winter and got us considerable improvements in forecasting accuracy. So this is a summary of the 5 M competitions. And the last one that I'm doing right now is a financial competition, real life. It's going to use real life data from the stock market, the Standard & Poor's 500 index. It's going to be real time. It's going to be done on a 7 months interval. And it's going to ask for judgmental inputs. In other words, the forecasters are not going to use only quantitative information, but they're going to use also their judgment about what methods, or rather what stocks to buy in order to compete in the competition. So up to now, there have been 18 forecasting competitions. That will be the last one. And as you can see, it will cover much wider topics to test. And thank you. I think I did good forecast in terms of time that they're supposed to talk. And I'm open to questions. Christos, how we're going to go?
Thank you very much, Professor Makridakis. I think now if anyone has questions, please, you can open your mic and just ask, or raise your hand, and again, open your mic after that and ask. Okay, maybe I can with one question.
Yeah.
It's related to the competition. So I assume that the normal way to test and solve the challenges in forecasting or any other field would be through the research avenue, I guess. So I would say that the competitions provided another way to kind of to accelerate, right?
It provides a laboratory experimentation, provide concrete and objective evidence to judge the value of the different methods, the accuracy, the uncertainties.
And how does the, let's say, the forecasting community, let's say, reacted with this competition in terms of following the practices, let's say, that were proven, let's say, in these competitions?
Well, in the beginning, they were not very pleased because the statisticians, they thought that their methods, their sophisticated methods, should be the best. And then when they find out that the objective empirical evidence showed not the best, they were very upset. Now they have been accepted. Now the M competitions is probably the most cited articles in the forecasting literature.
Yeah, that's.
I don't know if I'm answering your question.
Yes, of course. That's. I kind of see that as a kind of a disrupting way to move, let's say, things forward, like in another way.
Well, yes, and sometimes the disruptive ways is the most useful because it defines the direction where to go. Like now, nobody questions anymore the value of combining. And as I told you, in the deep learning that they're using extensively, they combine up to 300 different models. They develop 300 models, and they take the median to make the forecast. So it's not anymore question the value of the competitions. At some point, there's a lot of questions about it. So now they're not. In the M5, there's something like 7,000 participants.
Yeah. I think just one small comment. I think there is some problem with your sound. Sometimes we can, at least I cannot hear you very, very well.
Okay, let me try to come closer.
Okay, maybe, yeah, no, it's better.
Okay. I think I saw Nikos had a question. Nikos Bakas.
Yes. Hello, Professor. Hello, and thank you very much for your talk. It was a pleasure hearing you again. I would like to ask something about the uncertainty. If I understood well, you told us that at the M4 competition, the methods underestimate the uncertainty.
Up to M4.
Up
M1,
to M4.
M2, and M3, they underestimate uncertainty greatly. In the M4, the two top methods, they were perfect estimating uncertainty. The others did not do very well. In the M5, they learned about from the best methods to the M4, and they estimate uncertainty correctly.
Okay. And I saw the results of the M5, and the XG boost was the best one. I think the first and the second.
Yeah, the first and the second. And most of the top methods were machine learning.
Okay.
Yeah.
And one last question: the uncertainty, you measure it like standard deviation, or there
the
are
uncertainty. Yeah, it's based on some form of the standard deviation. Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Thanks. Okay.
And we have another question from Max.
I think he just answered the question. Thanks for the presentation and the great overview. I'm coming from a humanities background and also had the same question: what exactly does it mean to predict uncertainty? But I think he just answered this question.
Well, uncertainty, you needed to make decisions, like in the inventory example I told you. You have to balance what would be the cost of throwing away a bottle of milk that you have in the shelf and you don't sell, versus what's going to happen if some customer comes to buy a certain bottle of milk and he or she cannot find it. And that's a typical example, okay, of using uncertainty to make decisions.
Thank you.
Max?
Thank you.
Are there any more questions? I think we have time for another one, and then we have to proceed to the next talk. Okay, then thanks again, Professor Makridakis.
You're welcome.
It was very, very interesting to see such a kind of dense overview of the field and of the competition.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Sai, are you in the